Welcome back. Well, a federal judge has thrown out Justice Department grand jury subpoenas aimed at Minnesota Governor Tim Walz and his allies, calling them an abusive and retaliatory process to punish Walz based on his refusal to assist President Donald Trump's immigration crackdown. A political professor at Hamline University, David Schultz, joins us now. David, thanks for joining me.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So, David, I've seen plenty of political pundits call this a blistering ruling. What's your take?
Well, it's certainly not the most favorable to the Trump administration, we will say that. And this is coming from a judge, I should point out, who was a Bush 1 appointee. That's important to think about here. And also earlier this year, he had written a memo and criticized the federal prosecutor here for disregarding over 100 court orders. So he's a judge who has been very much concerned and been at the front lines in terms of the Trump administration's actions in Minnesota. And this opinion here, order here, doesn't mince any words regarding how he views the subpoenas here. So it's a little bit predictable in terms of where he's been for the last few months, but generally we don't see judges come down this hard.
Many believe that the administration uses the criminal process to retaliate against their adversaries. This judge called it unethical, but how did he actually come to the conclusion that the investigation was in order to harass a political opponent?
Okay, so first off, what the judge does say is that generally subpoenas will be considered to be valid, especially issued by grand juries, unless the primary purpose is questionable. And what the judge does here is to look at sort of really a pattern of several months in Minnesota. He looks at both statements that Donald Trump has made about Minnesota, as well as the ICE activities, the request for other documents, and basically puts together a picture. Remember, this is the judge speaking here in his opinion, and argues that to him, that the subpoenas here are no more than retaliatory. I mean, the line here is something along the lines, if he said that, the federal government may not coerce or retaliate against state or public subdivisions who decline to help the federal government enforce federal laws. And so what he's saying here is that the Trump administration is retaliating, is picking on the state of Minnesota, again, drawing upon Trump's comments and a whole bunch of activities, and saying that this questions the real motive of the subpoena. And because of that, that raises one question. But the second part, I think, is also important to understand here, is that there's a basic principle of federalism. Federalism basically says that except in very narrow circumstances, the U.S. government can't, what's the phrase in the law, can't commandeer or coerce states to do certain things. And so put together the two things here. One, the judges reached the conclusion this is all politically motivated based upon statements by the Trump administration. And two, that political motivation questions the ability of the federal government here to try to coerce or force the state of Minnesota to do certain things. And these subpoenas are just one more example of the federal government trying to compel the state of Minnesota to do certain things.
Well, on that note, will this impact any future efforts by the administration?
Well, they can't appeal this right now because the time has expired. But could they go forward with other investigations? Yes, they could do a variety of other things and try to go around the judge's ruling. But this lays out a relatively high bar at this point, because you've got a district court judge saying at this point that these subpoenas really are, again, politically motivated, and two, violate the principles of federalism. So the Trump administration is going to have to, if it wants to go forward and say that, no, we are seeking the subpoenas against Walz, against Ellison, against Mayor Frey, not for retaliatory reasons, but for purely legitimate investigatory purposes. But on the surface here, given the fraud that we have in the state, what appears to be, from feeding our future and so forth, you think that would have been enough. You would think that would have been enough to say, he's got reasonable grounds, that is the Justice Department, to subpoena government officials here. But in issuing this ruling, it makes it difficult for future subpoenas to Walz, to Ellison, to Frey, but it doesn't impede their ability to do things like other investigations, such as, again, more defeating our future or other fraud scandals.
So going forward, will the administration have to change their tactics when for going after opponents?
Yes, they're going to have to. Yeah, I mean, right off the bat, the way you phrase it here is important to understand. Here is that you can't go after your opponents because you don't like your opponents. I mean, that is just, as the judge pointed out here, that is just blatantly unconstitutional. Now, can the Trump administration say we have reasonable grounds that there's a fraud problem in the state and they want to do fraud investigations and request materials? That they can do, but they can't do it in a way that looks retaliatory. Now, exactly what that means, not clear. The other thing that's important to understand here, and this has been at the heart of a debate going on since Operation Metro Surge, is that there is a fine line between obstruction and not cooperating. The state of Minnesota is under no obligation, as the judge points out here, under no constitutional obligation to cooperate with the federal government in its enforcement of the laws. It can't obstruct, but it can't be forced to cooperate. And the judge seems to draw a relatively clear line here and say that what you're doing, Trump administration, is trying to punish the state of Minnesota for its refusal to cooperate, and the state is well within its constitutional authority not to cooperate.
Okay, so you brought up the Feeding Our Future fraud. I mean, we've had several congressional reports, in Republican-led committees that have accused Governor Walz and Keith Ellison, our Attorney General, of failing to prevent or adequately respond to large fraud schemes in Minnesota. So, will they be able to? Because I assume that they will, I mean, I think it was J.D. Vance has called for federal investigations into both of those people. Will they try to go after them in a different way? I mean, this had to do with the immigration crackdown, but
they can still do examination for possible fraud in the state of Minnesota, but it doesn't look like right now that they can subpoena Walz or Ellison or Jacob Frey. There may be other people they can subpoena, other information they can request, but right now, unless something changes, and exactly what that is, it's not clear at this point. The judge more or less is saying you can't go after those government officials because, again, you're trying to compel them, force them to go along with what you want. And so, again, it shouldn't impede, the Medicaid. It shouldn't impede some of the other investigations here. But the Justice Department is going to have to be, let us say, more exact, and maybe more circumspect. I'm not sure what I'm looking for here, but in terms of what they're doing, because I think the other thing that the judge points out here is that a lot of the subpoena requests here seem to have almost a fishing expedition aspect to them. And again, the Justice Department is going to have to be more fine-tuned, more exact in terms of what it requests.
Okay, the judge did opt to unseal the material with this. Why do you think he did that?
I think he did that for a couple of reasons. One is just, again, for transparency's sake, but two, again, I think, again, Patrick Schultz at this point has been very, very upset with the Trump administration's decisions to not comply with court orders. As I mentioned a couple of minutes ago here, at one point earlier this year, he said to the prosecutors, you folks have basically disregarded almost 100 orders that we as judges have issued in Minnesota. So I think the district court judge here is releasing and unsealing it here, I think is kind of a public accountability, public warning, putting them on notice regarding exactly what's going on here. I mean, clearly the transparency isn't of itself it isn't of itself important, but I think there's somewhat of a deterrence aspect here in terms of putting the Trump administration on public notice.
I want to go back to something you said earlier on in this interview. You pointed out that this judge was a Republican nominee. He was nominated
Correct.
by George W. Bush. What does it tell you that he was willing to go against the Trump administration as a Republican nominee?
Well, a couple of different things. First, he's a senior judge, which I mean, all judges are supposed to be insulated from politics. I mean, but this tells us a couple of different things here. One, it does speak to, on one level, a split even within the Republican Party. Let's say old line Republicans, Trump Republicans, and I think that's part of one aspect here. But two, it also speaks to the fact that here is a judge who's senior, been on the bench for many, many years, and is probably approaching it from a different perspective than, let's say, more recent judges. Also, I think it's significant here that it's a Republican judge because it's going to make it harder, not impossible, but harder for Donald Trump to say, well, this is just a decision by a Democratic judge in a Democratic state. No, this is a well-respected judge, who's been on the bench for, I'm going to say, what is it? What's my calculation here? 25 or 30 years, and has very, very well-established Republican roots. I think at one point was also the dean of the law school of the University of St. Thomas, and somehow associated with St. Thomas. I can't remember what exactly it was here. So he's got a long set of roots.
Wow, very interesting. David Schultz, political professor at Hamline University, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.